that I take you on a journey. I take you on a journey instead. This journey will take us from the shores of Georgian Bay, up the Musquash River to Bala, across Lake Muskoka to Bracebridge on the Muskoka River, up the south branch of the Muskoka River, all the way up to the Lake of Bays, across Lake of Bays, up the Oxtongue River, and up to the height of land in what's now Algonquin Park. Our journey will, I hope, accomplish 3 objectives this morning, that will help us to consider more thoughtfully the rest of the talks that we're going to hear today over the other sessions, as well as better inform our everyday lives as we make choices as property owners, as community leaders, engaged citizens, taxpayers, and consumers. The first objective is to remind us that every section of Muskoka's shoreline is part of a larger socio-ecological system centered on the region's watershed. That is, every section of our shoreline is a blend of human society and the natural world, which cannot be considered separate from one another. What humans do along the shoreline has an impact on the natural world. But the natural world also exerts an ongoing influence over the decisions we make and the kind of actions we take. Moreover, from the banks of the Musquash River to the shores of Lake Muskoka to the remote backwoods sites in Algonquin Park, every section of shoreline in Muskoka is connected and inseparable. By journeying together, all of us here, from Georgian Bay to Algonquin Park, I want us to think about our particular section of shoreline as part of a larger system. So if we take a look at this slide here, which is right off the Muskoka Watershed Council website. You can find it on there. What we see here is that all the different sections of shoreline that a lot of us are familiar with, they're all color-coded here. Each of these different sections can be thought of separately, individually. They all have their own characteristics, but they also butt up against each other. They're also all connected. When you consider the way that they are connected, you get a sense for the entire whole, the whole socio-ecological system, this human blend, this blend of society and the natural world. So I want us to think about each section of this watershed as part of a larger system. The second objective in taking this journey is for us to explore the environmental history of Muskoka's shoreline. Almost all of Muskoka's history took place along the shores of lakes and rivers. So it makes sense to follow the contours of the shoreline in order to explore the contours of the past. Currents of time carry us downstream. So in order to explore the past, we must travel against the current upstream. Thus, our journey will begin at the bottom of the watershed and push upstream to discover the ways in which Muskoka's shoreline was influenced, but at the same time shaped by society, culture, and economy. But all journeys are incomplete until we have returned to the point from which we started. So, that's the third objective of this journey. The return trip, if you will, is to consider what lessons the environmental history of Muskoka's shoreline has for us today as we think about our footprint in Muskoka and how we can be better stewards of our own shorelines and Muskoka's entire watershed. Our journey, as I said, is going to begin at the mouth of the Musquash River, I think. There we are. Where the shoreline of Georgian Bay turns inland and becomes the shoreline of Muskoka. For people from Muskoka and Georgian Bay today, the distinction between these places is stark and meaningful. if perhaps a little hard to explain. But the geographical transition is more subtle. The physical shoreline geology, more alike than the cultural imaginations that we have created to distinguish Georgian Bay from Muskoka. So you can see here these two pictures, which I took on a canoe trip last year from my parents' place on Lake Joseph to my grandparents' place on Go Home on Georgian Bay. I took each of these photos along the way. The one on the top left here is Georgian Bay, and the one on the bottom right is Lake Muskoka. And as much as there are some characteristic differences which we can all acknowledge, I think it's pretty obvious, though, that there are some really obvious and distinct similarities between the geologies and the overall environments between Georgian Bay and Muskoka. So again, reinforcing this idea that it's part of a larger system. For the Aboriginal peoples of South Central Ontario, who spent time every year in Muskoka, this subtle transition between shoreline environments did not involve cultural distinctions in the way that we kind of think about Georgian Bay today and Muskoka. Rather, Georgian Bay and Muskoka were two parts of a larger Indigenous suite of places, which when taken together comprised their home. As we move upstream along the Musquash, we encounter not only the history of Muskoka's first peoples, but the very route that they took to connect the shorelines of Georgian Bay with the shoreline of Muskoka. So that first map I showed you of the route we're going to take today, it went from Georgian Bay up through Muskoka and up to the height of land in Algonquin Park. There are great documentary sources to demonstrate that actually was a route that Aboriginal people took from places along Georgian Bay inland into Muskoka, in addition to other routes that went up from Lake Couchiching and Simcoe up through Muskoka as well. 200 years ago, when the Chippewa of South Central Ontario formed an alliance with the British during the War of 1812, 200 years ago, actually this year, this system of movement between places followed a river mouth and inland pattern of subsistence, combining seasonal trips inland during the fall and winter to hunt and trap with coastal fishing and trading during the spring and summer. This seasonal cycle was purposeful and mimicked the cycle of natural resource availability over an extremely large geographic area. So the decisions Aboriginal peoples made about pursuing certain resources made it so that both Muskoka and Georgian Bay were an important part of their entire system that they considered their home. Still do. When the days were long and nature most productive, families gathered to share abundant resources. In the early spring, for example, the Chippewa all moved to the shores of Georgian Bay, or Lake Simcoe or Lake Couchiching, where some of the other bands spent their fishing season, and lived in large fishing camps. The spring fish run supported comparatively large concentrations of people, and was therefore the most important component in the Chippewa seasonal cycle. The amount of fish caught and preserved determined the schedule of resource harvesting over the rest of the year too. So when fish runs were plentiful, the seasonal cycle was routine. But when the fish runs were meager, the Chippewa put a greater reliance on inland resources to see them through the year. In October and November, after a summer of gathering berries and cultivating corn and squash potatoes, a late fall hunt for meat and skins was carried out before the rivers and lakes began to freeze. For the winter months, the Chippewa usually dispersed into smaller groups or its immediate family units, depending on the severity of the wintertime conditions. But typically, winter was spent in mid-sized camps comprised of several families located along the shores of inland waterways in Muskoka, where the microclimate was somewhat milder than along the coasts of Georgian Bay, or Lake Simcoe, or Lake Couchining, some of the other larger bodies of water that they spent some of the springtime fishing in. So the important point, of course, here to take away is that the winter time next to larger bodies of water like Georgian Bay or Lake Simcoe tended to be much harsher, much more severe, and inland locations had much milder winters for them, even though a little bit more snow. The important point to consider is that Muskoka's natural systems could support human needs for only part of the year. So the Chippewa who spent time here did so on a seasonal basis. Moreover, since the game and fur-bearing animals the Chippewa hunted during the winter were also dispersed, so too were the Chippewa themselves. In other words, during the first half of the 19th century, the human presence along the shoreline of Muskoka was not year-round and was not concentrated. So because of the resource availability over different parts of the year, when Aboriginal people did spend time in Muskoka, they did so in smaller concentrations of people and for only part of the year. Inconspicuously, our journey upstream steers us into another body of water, the Moon River. Yet as we approach Battle Falls, it becomes apparent again that Muskoka's shoreline is part of a larger socio-ecological system. The waters of Lake Muskoka, which themselves have origins further upstream, spill over the falls and flow into the Moon River and Musquash down into Georgian Bay. Thus, while long stretches of the Musquash River and the entirety of Lake Muskoka appear to rest as static bodies of water, at Battle Falls we are confronted with the reality that Muskoka's rivers and lakes are actually dynamic, part of a literally fluid system that's constantly changing. The irony, however, is that historically the Battle Falls also represent an attempt by human beings to enforce stability and equilibrium on the shoreline of Muskoka. The earliest efforts to harness the power of these waters and impose some stability on the shoreline of Battle was in 1869 or 1870, when the founder of that community, this dapper young fellow here, Thomas Burgess, built a combination saw and grist mill on the north side of the falls. While Burgess's mill did not alter the flow of the water over the falls, it did provide the foundations for a permanent year-round settlement at this site. And almost half a century later, in 1917, the very nature of hydropower at Battle was changed when Burgess built the community's first hydroelectric generating station. Yet harnessing the power of the falls was far less influential in shaping the stability of the shoreline than the efforts made to dam the falls just a few years later. During the early years of white resettlement, folks like Thomas Burgess, located next to the shoreline of Muskoka's watershed, next to the shore, when he located next to the shoreline, Muskoka's watershed was entirely unregulated in 1869 or 1870. This meant the water level of Lake Muskoka, for example, could fluctuate as much as 9 feet between the spring and the fall. The variability of water level presented interesting challenges to life in the early 1870s, which I think we all tend to take for granted nowadays when we think about the lake as being static. Depending on the time of year they arrived, homesteaders who took up land along low-lying stretches might find themselves either dozens of feet further from or actually inundated by changing water levels during their first year. So those who arrived before the dam was put in arrived to a system on the lake they could see the water level drop or rise 9 feet, which for certain people located in particular areas of the shoreline could have been quite dramatic in their first year. Navigation on Lake Muskoka in 1870 was even more hazardous. The absence of charts and fluctuating water levels meant that captains of Muskoka's earliest steamers had to contend with a shifting arrangement of sandbars and rocky outcroppings over the course of the navigation season. So unstable water levels made for unstable shorelines. Unpredictable water levels made for unpredictable shorelines. The solution, of course, as we all know, was to impose human control over the level of the lake by constructing a dam across Battle Falls. The dam was completed in November 1874, but maintained the water at a rather high level. And while this proved ideal for navigation, it actually worsened the flood risk along certain low-lying areas of the shoreline, necessitating the need for a second channel and control dam to deal with the high water levels in flood years. So I think I couldn't really get a great map of the Baloff through Google. For some reason the resolution is really poor as you zoom in. But what I think we should take away from this slide anyway is that the mill stream along here was the first to get settled and the first to impose some human control in the shoreline. And it wasn't interfered with very much. The North Falls, when it was dammed, had the most lasting impact, the shoreline of Muskoka, impacts that we still see today, and in fact necessitated the need for at the South Falls, for an entirely new cut to be put in at the falls and a control dam to be put in. So this is a good example of sort of unintended consequences of attempts to control the natural environment by humans and sort of added efforts to regain that control when nature sort of posed new problems. Few other human interventions have influenced shoreline development in Muskoka as much as the damming of Battle Falls. Without the stability provided by constant water levels, pioneers could not have settled low-lying areas without risk of having homes and crops flooded. Steamboat transportation would have been far less safe, and cottaging would have been less appealing. Once the dam was built, however, Lake Muskoka appeared to remain in static equilibrium. The level of the lake appears to remain unchanging over the course of the year. Yet this belied the fact that millions of liters of water continue to enter and leave Lake Muskoka each year as part of the watershed's dynamic, fluid nature. Now, if Battle Falls obscures the role of humans in shaping the shoreline in our journey across Lake Muskoka, this journey across Lake Muskoka is going to do quite the opposite. While any view from the water these days conveys images of affluence and leisure, the dotted shoreline, which we can see a couple of examples here, is actually a legacy. I hope it's no one's cottage. Is actually a legacy of Muskoka's pioneer past. So these images we see of dotted shorelines in Muskoka today is actually a legacy of Muskoka's pioneer past. In an effort to stem the tide of emigration, people leaving Canada to the United States during the middle of the 19th century, the government of Upper Canada opened several new districts to settlement, including Muskoka in 1858. Townships were surveyed and 100-acre plots laid out over Muskoka's eclectic topography. The Rogers 1879 Guidebook and Atlas of Muskoka and Parry Sound, which this map is taken from, illustrates how this fee simple, freehold property system reconceptualized Muskoka's shoreline as the edge of unproductive space within an agrarian society. So if we take a look at this map of Monk Township in 1879 that comes out of Rogers Atlas, we see that the details that we're supposed to pay attention to on this map are all on the land. the shoreline acts as an edge between what we're supposed to pay attention to and what is peripheral to our gaze in the 1870s or early 1880s. You see the concession lines and the roads and even the names of the property owners. But past the edge, past the shoreline, there's no more detail apart from saying that's Lake Muskoka. And if you think about, if you compare that to the maps we have today, there's tons more information on maps today about the water, the lake depth, navigation details. None of those are included on maps in the 1870s. The focus is on an agrarian place, an agrarian society, and the land is the focus, not the water. While the land adjacent to the lake or river was certainly seen as being extremely advantageous, apart from a narrow focus next to the home or wharf, the vast majority of shoreline was peripheral to the gaze of the first generation pioneer. Now, we may question such an outlook today, but during the 1870s, it was the land that occupied place of prominence in the homesteader's eyes. These settlers perceived the forests as an obstacle to progress, wealth, and happiness. And so they took a confrontational attitude towards what they saw as wilderness. We probably wouldn't call it wilderness these days. They set to work clearing the trees in order to plant crops, which often included clearing land right down to the shoreline. And I don't know how well people can make out these pictures, but they demonstrate pretty well these early efforts to entirely clear the landscape. This fellow in the middle, it's actually right in the middle of the deed. He's got an axe in his hand. And as much as there are some stumps that demonstrate how quickly these pictures were taken after the process was underway, you can see in at least both the top and the bottom pictures that shoreline or the tree cover and the vegetation was cleared right down to the shore in many cases. The unintended consequences of removing trees and other vegetation next to the water was substantial shoreline erosion. In an 1872 article from the Toronto Mail, the author revealed that in too many instances, the settlers had made the mistake of clearing the timber from the rocks. The result had been that the soil, being no longer held by the fibrous roots of the trees, is readily washed away by the rains, so that the rocky protuberances look and really are more marked and bare than ever. Farming was generally a disappointment, and at worst an outright failure. But the entire length of shoreline in Muskoka was, with very few exceptions, private property by the 1880s. Beyond the immediate environmental transformations wrought by homestead farming, the transfer of waterfront from the Crown to landowners had a lasting impact on the history of shoreline development in Muskoka. Despite its legacy, as we push across Lake Muskoka, it's very apparent that little of Muskoka's pioneer past remains. On my trip down from Lake Joseph down in Georgian Bay last year, I passed one barn on the whole way. Almost as quickly as lakeshore settlers realized the limitations to their land, tourists arrived to provide a new opportunity. Although the first hotels were established in the early 1870s, it was not until the 1880s that tourism emerged as a defined sector of the local economy. As the demand for lodging rose, several settlers transformed their homes into boarding houses and hotels, as we all know. Some of these were so successful with the summer crowd that by the end of the century, regular guests to these hotels were asking to buy land from the proprietors. At Beaumaris, which became the haunts for wealthy Americans from Pittsburgh, members of a group known as the Solid Comfort Camp and their friends bought individual properties along the shore of Tondern Island, which is circled in red here. Sadly, I don't have any pictures of these early cottages that were built on Tondern Isle, which came to be called Little Pittsburgh, and then a little bit later than that, Millionaire's Row. But there are a lot of great pictures of Beaumaris from the late 1880s and 1890s. And what I think these pictures really demonstrate well is that places like Beaumaris, these hotels, really acted as social and economic nodes on the lake. It attracted tourists, but in turn, because of its important social and economic role, it also attracted cottagers to want to set up their cottages in close proximity to the hotels for social reasons or for being able to get to the general store, and obviously because of the steamer wharf. A similar pattern emerged even without a hotel to act as a catalyst. At the north end of Lake Rosso, F.W. Coate bought several hundred acres of land, which he and his family dubbed Cape Elizabeth. Coate was married with 5 adult children, 4 sons and 1 daughter, but only one of his sons lived year-round with him in Muskoka. The rest of them visited every summer. In 1887, Coate deeded a small shoreline property to his daughter and son-in-law to build a cottage of their own. And family members consistently insisted that severing more lots for cottages would be a good move. That's actually what he wrote in his journal in the 1890s, was that severing more lots for cottages would be a good move. Although no more cottages were built by the time Coate died in 1893, after the turn of the century, at least one more son and a family acquaintance are known to have acquired severed lots from the estate, and they too built cottages. What we see then with these late 19th century settler tourist colonies, if I can call them settler tourist colonies, so I call in my research, I call these areas where hotels established and attracted cottagers to come in, sort of settler tourist colonies, so places that became sort of important social and economic nodes around the lakes. What we can see from these colonies is the earliest examples of shoreline subdivision in Muskoka, as the land was commodified in response to the demand for lakeside cottaging. Although this type of development proved to be extremely beneficial to the local economy, it had the side effect of further intensifying the pressure on Muskoka's most sensitive ecological niche, the shoreline. The repercussions, well, maybe I should just say something quickly about what we're looking at here. I couldn't find a lot of any pictures. I don't have any pictures, sadly, of F.W. Coate's property, but each of these properties on Lake Joseph and Lake Rosso are examples of settler homes that were purchased and then transformed into cottages by visitors from outside Muskoka. The repercussions of intensifying shoreline development were not, however, lost on the more politically engaged members of Muskoka's community. As early as 1903, the Muskoka Lakes Association included septic and waste concerns in its annual yearbook, instructing residents on waste separation and proper sewage sanitation. In this 1913 yearbook, an article entitled "Instructions to Householders Regarding the Disposal of House Wastes" insisted that a septic tank is the complete and permanent solution to the whole problem of human waste, since it deals automatically with sewage wastes, whether solid or liquids, without any nuisance. Can you imagine how much of a nuisance it would have been before? A year later, in the summer of 1914, the province's chief assistant medical officer and the district inspector traveled around the lower lakes, Rosso, Muskoka, and Joseph, assessing the adequacy of sanitation facilities in hotels and cottages. They visited 56 properties, several of which had, in their words, paid little attention to such matters, and warned them that unless a radical change was made, their places would be closed and the names published. Can you imagine that today? Maybe that's actually not a bad idea. They estimated, however, that roughly 100 septic systems were installed across Muskoka. That's not bad for 1914. In 1920, the Sanitation Subcommittee of the MLA happily reported that the continued purity of the water in the lakes is a matter of congratulation, and it is hoped that the members of this association will do all in their power to see that no cottager or resort keeper pollutes it. I think sentiments that are still echoed today in the MLA. Waterfront property subdivision presents another interesting irony then to the history of shoreline development in Muskoka. Since the increasing concentration of lakeside residents was both contributing to and providing solutions for the socio-ecological problems associated with intensifying shoreline development. Leaving Lake Muskoka and making our way up the Muskoka River, it's apparent the Muskoka shoreline is not entirely rural. As we approach Bracebridge along the lower reaches of the river, the scale of human footprint along the urban shoreline becomes much bigger than anywhere else in Muskoka. For it is here in Bracebridge that we and Muskoka's environmental history first encounter the effects of industrialization. Moreover, it is here where the north and south branches of Muskoka the Muskoka River join, that we can once again clearly see the reciprocal relationship between the watershed and the human footprint along the shoreline. In 1877, Beardmore and Company opened the first tannery in Muskoka just below the North Falls at what was then the outskirts of Bracebridge. I think they're building a bunch of homes there now. I wonder if one of those homeowners know that their homes are built on top of old tannery grounds. Probably do. Although the company was certainly attracted to Muskoka and Bracebridge thanks to a generous tax break by the city in its first 10 years, the real reason Muskoka was chosen as a location for expanding operations was because of the abundance of hemlock trees in the region. Hemlock bark contains tannins that, when leached out of the hemlock trees and dissolved into water, produces tannic acid, essential for tanning cowhides into heavy sole leather and harness leather. Also included in the tanning process at different times were chemical compounds such as sodium sulfide, lime, sulfuric acid, aluminum sulfide, potassium bichromate, and lead acetate, among others. Not really all that appetizing. By locating below the falls at Bracebridge, the tannery ensured that once these toxic soups had surpassed their usefulness, that they could be disposed of easily and be carried away by the fast-flowing rivers of the Muskoka River just below the falls. Locating below the falls was also important because Beardmore was able to access tan bark from the lower lakes. In order to meet the need for the thousands of cords required to operate the tannery each year, the company arranged to pick up enormous loads of tan bark from different locations around the lakes, much of which came from private landowners. These two pictures here illustrate the sheer scale of the tan bark loads that were being brought from Lake Muskoka, Lake Joseph, Lake Rosso, and then up to the Beardmore Tannery in Bracebridge. And these are just cords of the bark. These don't even show you how many trees would have been brought down in order to produce this much bark. For example, in 1886, after the company had been renamed the Muskoka Leather Company, John Martin and Joseph Chambers on Lake Joseph sold Beardmore 42 and 60 cords of tan bark respectively, while on Lake Rosso, Charles Judd and Charles Harrington sold 122 and 101 cords each. In this way, the watershed acted as a conduit by which Muskoka's forested ecosystem was linked into a wider network of global commodity flows, which included hides, shipped to Muskoka from as far away as Argentina, and rough finished leather sent to metropolitan factories where it was then turned into shoes and harnesses. Conversely, the watershed also acted as a conduit for carrying contaminants from these processes back downstream. So the Muskoka River acted as a conduit to carry bark upstream and contaminants back downstream. The end result, of course, was that by the 1920s, hemlock was as scarce in Muskoka as white pine had been a generation earlier, and an indeterminate portion of the shoreline ecology below the tannery was degraded. Leaving Bracebridge behind us and taking the south rather than the north branch of the Muskoka River, although the north branch is very nice too, let's accelerate our journey a little bit and get past Lake of Bays and the Ox Tongue River up to the height of land in now what is the southeast west corner of Algonquin Park. This takes us to the top of our watershed in Muskoka, where to the shoreline that is quite arguably the least connected to Muskoka's larger socio-ecological system. Indeed, disconnecting and protecting this area from human influence was the intention of the provincial government with the creation of Algonquin Park in 1893. Although images of Algonquin Park made famous by this fella, Tom Thompson, and the group of 7, and they've come to symbolize a certain essential Canadian national character, inspiration for the park was derived from late 19th century ideas regarding the closing of the frontier and anxieties about the loss of wilderness that were common both north and south of the border. Advocates for conservation in the United States and Canada, many of whom were leading politicians at all levels of government, insisted that large parcels of land devoid of people, no people living in them, were a vital antidote to the worst effects of urbanization, industrialization, and the colonization of the natural world by human beings. The trouble with wilderness, however, is that by perpetuating this belief that humans and the natural world can and should be kept separate, we obscure the ways in which humans have shaped these places. By thinking about Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park the way Tom Thompson did, we are encouraged to think that the shoreline has no history. To ignore the shoreline as a site of fall Chippewa hunting camps, the base of operations for the Gilmore Lumber Company, or the route of the Ottawa, Arnprior, and Parry Sound Railway. So here we are. We're at the top of the watershed. Can't go any further this way. Sitting as Tom Thompson did so many times on Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park, thinking about the relationship between humans and the natural world. I bet everybody's tired, right? We just canoed in like 40 minutes from Georgian Bay to Algonquin Park. I'm beat. But we're not done. We must make the return trip back to downstream and into the present to consider what lessons we can learn from Muskoka's environmental history and how we might apply them to our lives along the shoreline in 2012. There are at least 5 lessons to take away, one for each of the stops we've made in our journey. The first is that the history of Algonquin Park illustrates that we cannot afford to think about humans and nature as being separate. Protecting large chunks of land from a human footprint and development is a worthy goal, but setting aside wilderness should not allow us to become disconnected from the natural world. Just because the human footprint is extremely small inside the borders of the Algonquin Park doesn't mean our footprint outside the borders of the park should be allowed to expand without limits that reflect the environmental realities of where we live. The false dualism that sees humans and nature as separate, which the existence of Algonquin Park and the very idea of wilderness encourages, must not obscure the fact that we use and exploit nature. If we can't use and protect nature, the same time in the same place, then eventually we won't be able to do either. Second, and somewhat related, the history of the Beardmore Tannery reveals that indeed Muskoka's shoreline was once host to large-scale industrial processes that targeted and exhausted specific resources, while at the same time contaminating local ecologies. Inarguably, the human presence along the Muskoka River below Bracebridge is less damaging than it was in 1920. Yet producing things in Muskoka and being involved in a wider regional and global economy isn't inherently bad. Rather, it is the scale of production and development that we must give careful consideration. There has always been and will continue to be demand for Muskoka's resources, but that demand must be measured against the impact of development on Muskoka's shoreline and the larger socio-ecological system of which it's a part. Third, the transfer of almost all of Muskoka's shoreline into private hands has led to one of Muskoka's great ironies. Although the worst effects of agriculture were short-lived in Muskoka, the rise of tourism and cottaging at the end of the 19th century placed more intense pressures on sensitive shoreline ecologies as properties were subdivided. The irony then is that although cottaging and tourism is premised on the enjoyment of a healthy shoreline ecosystem, both tourism and cottaging have become the greatest contributors to shoreline development in Muskoka's history. Undoubtedly, this trend will continue, and putting long undeveloped waterfront properties into land trusts may provide some solutions in some cases, but there must also be incentives and regulations regarding lakeside development that are directly informed by the environmental limitations inherent to the shoreline. Fourth, the history of Battle Falls, and this is where I might get into. The history of Battle Falls suggests that static views of the environment and our shoreline, in particular, are short-sighted and unrealistic. The recent debates about the future of the falls, while cognizant of the environmental risks of further hydroelectric development, have, to my knowledge, ignored the long history of human modifications made to this landscape and the impact they have had on the shoreline. Damming the falls kept the water levels of the lakes largely constant throughout the year, a consequence that everyone living on Lake Muskoka still benefits from. Furthermore, Bala exists where it does because the falls were a site of power that could be harnessed for human purposes. Electricity is a part of our everyday lives, and the history of hydropower at the falls forces us to consider where that electricity comes from and where the consequences of generating that power should reside. Finally, the history of the Musquash River reminds us that the Muskoka we see all around us is also part and product of a colonial history. While this history is not exclusive to Muskoka by any means, we must be aware that Algonquin Park, the site of Beardmore and Company, all of our homes and cottages, the Battle Falls, and the rest of Muskoka's watershed and shoreline were and continue to be inhabited by First Nations people. The Beausoleil First Nation on Christian Island, the Chippewa of Georgina Island, the Rama First Nation, the Wasauksing First Nation on Perry Island, the Wata Mohawks First Nation have a long history in Muskoka, which all of us can learn from. Aboriginal peoples who spent time in Muskoka understood the shoreline as being part of a larger socio-ecological system and maintained a presence along the shoreline that reflected local environmental limitations. Okay, well, that's the end of our journey. So we're back where we started. I hope this was an enjoyable talk and journey. I hope it also has prepared everyone a little bit to engage more thoughtfully with the talks over the rest of the day. But also, and more importantly, I really hope that this has helped us consider ways that we can think about our shoreline, how that connects both to the larger socio-ecological system that is Muskoka, as well as the environmental history that has shaped that shoreline for the last 200 years. Thanks.